Welcome everyone. Welcome back. Welcome back into this room. Welcome to another great year that we have lined up of History of Material Texts. As you may know, and frankly, as we may know, but we're not certain, the seminar was probably founded in January of 1993 by Peter Stalybras, which means that in the middle of this year, we'll celebrate our 30th anniversary, which is a really long time to be running weekly seminars every week of the semester. I'm Zach Lesser, professor in the English department. I co-organized the seminar with John Pollock, curator in the Kislak Center, and Jerry Singerman, humanities editor emeritus at the Penn Press. And we're thrilled to have Eileen Malcolm back this year as the Brisbane Schoenberg Graduate Fellow. So Eileen, among the many other things, maintains our listserv. And if you're not yet on it, and I know there's some first-year grads here who have not had the chance to get on it, you just can list your email on the sign-up sheet that's going around, and we will add you to the list. If you're joining us via Zoom, you can also just find the link to get on our list if you're not on it on our website, pennmaterialtext.org. So we've got a great lineup of speakers, and I just wanted to thank also our advisory board for their help in putting that together, giving us suggestions. Shira Brisman and Julie Davis in art history, Devin Patel in South Asia studies, and Whitney Tritine in English. As you can see, we're streaming on Zoom this year, as we've done since guess when. And it is great, as always, to see a lot of far-flung faces on Zoom. We do plan to keep doing this in the future. We're still 2 years on. We're still working out the tech side of things a little. We've got a system going. It's maybe not ideal, but it works. But wave your arms on Zoom if you're having any technical difficulties, or you can write in the chat, which Eileen will be monitoring. You can also write questions in the chat, and Eileen will either surface those questions to us or call on you to unmute in the Q&A and ask your question live. So I'm really glad to convene this year's series, and I'm now going to turn the introduction over to John Pollock, since it's his boss, so he should do the introduction.
No pressure, John.
No pressure. Hi, everybody. Thank you, Zach. Yes, another welcome back to everyone. And I don't know if you're all like me, but I still get those butterflies at the beginning of a new academic year and a new semester, but it's like a good energy. So happy to see you folks online and in person. I will also note I did spot behind us here or on screen there, another co-founder of the Material Text Seminar, Michael Ryan, going way back to those 90s days that some of us vaguely remember. And so thank you, Zach and Jerry and Eileen, and it's a pleasure for me to introduce our speaker, Sean Quimby. As many of you know, I have a sort of slightly formal but also informal mode. Sean happens to be my boss, as you heard, but I do not say that with a shudder. Indeed, in this moment of royal transitions and talk of royalty, of queens and kings, commemorations and coronations, I'm happy to report that Sean carries the scepter of authority and wears the crown of the Kislak Center with ease and grace. I will say, though, that Sean's title is itself almost regal. It's nearly too long for your average business card. He is Associate University Librarian for Special Collections, Director of the J.I. Kislak Center, and Director of the Schoenberg Institute for Manuscript Studies at the University of Pennsylvania Library. Quiz on that later. He oversees the domains that you can see around you here on the 6th and some of the 5th floors, plus farther flung lands that you cannot see. The Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies, the University Archives and Record Center. Before coming to Penn, Sean was the director of the Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Columbia University, and before that, director of Special Collections at Syracuse University. Even before that, not to go too far in the past, he processed the Buckminster Fuller Archive at Stanford. That would be a fun topic for another evening. So Sean actually entered his role here in 2020 at that very difficult time during the pandemic. He was therefore an online ruler for many months, a sovereign we could only contemplate from afar in virtual space. Despite that, what I think we can all agree was an enormous obstacle, it's amazing how much he's already taken on and accomplished. Reviews of our collecting strategy, a new partnership with the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, rollouts of new tools for archives and archival holdings, and much, much else. Now, Zach, I'm sure, will tell us that the phrase, heavy is the head that wears the crown, is not actually or not exactly a line from Shakespeare. But I will just say that in his role here, despite all of the challenges, Sean has been a kind leader, a mentor, and a great colleague and friend for all of us. Now, Sean holds an MA in American History and Material Culture from the Hagley Fellows Program at the University of Delaware, and his MLIS from the University of Illinois. His family has deep material roots in the Delaware Valley and in its worlds of archives and libraries. I'm really happy personally that Sean has been able somehow to carve out time to become an active participant in this seminar, despite a web of administrative responsibilities and a weekly meeting calendar that frankly would send me back to bed to pull the covers over my head. And tonight we have the privilege of hearing him present on a project he's been working on for what, the last year or so, or a little more, centered around a remarkable comic that we acquired very recently, as you'll hear. This material text, I think, will show us that the methodological challenges posed by a printed object from 1947 may not be so dissimilar, perhaps, to those challenges posed by something from the 1500s. So let's plunge in, let's kick off our year and welcome Sean, whose talk is entitled Making the First Black Comic Book. Thank you, Sean.
All right. Hi, everybody. It's great to see such a large audience in person, and I think we have a pretty decent one out in cyberspace, including one of those Delaware Valley Quimbys, I think. Let me begin by thanking the organizers of the workshop for inviting me, and of course all of you for coming to attend. As John's introduction revealed, I'm not a bibliographer, nor am I a material text scholar. My career, to this point anyway, has really been about 20th and 21st century archives. Moreover, this project did not begin as a material text project. It actually didn't even really begin as a project. It began as an acquisition for the Kislak Center, when in December of 2020, the antiquarian book and photograph dealer, Stephen Lowenthal, pointed me to an upcoming Cowan's African Americana auction. It was here that I first learned of All-Negro Comics #1, and something of its origin story in post-war Philadelphia. Stephen placed a winning bid of $4,375, as you can see on the screen, and then very generously donated it to Penn. The comic book itself was extremely rare, with OCLC locating only 5 copies, and considering its significance as the first comic book made by and for African Americans, it was not especially well known. Google searches turn up Wikipedia articles here and there, a handful of pieces written by comics fans and amateur historians. And I don't mean that pejoratively in any sense, as I've come to depend upon that community. But all of this is really gray literature in the gray mist of cyberspace, with few, if any, citations to support claims. The best academic treatments I could find were an article by Blair Davis in Inks, the Journal of the Comic Studies Society, and a soon-to-be published essay by University of South Carolina English professor Kiana Whitted, who's editing a volume on Black comic books right now. In fact, it may be at press today. Here I want to pause and thanks Kiana in particular for providing me with a piece of evidence that in the end made this a material text project after all. You see, the assumption seems to have been that because only one issue of All-Negro Comics was published, and because it is now so scarce, that its impact was most likely limited. Surely it was an important first. The hero Lion Man predates Black Panther by nearly 20 years. But how important was it really? How many people back in 1947 actually read it? And what sort of lasting impact did it have on the history of African Americans in comics? I realized that the only way to answer these questions was to delve into the history of the comic book's production, distribution, and reception. And what I quickly came to realize that it was much more than a local anomaly that circulated in limited quantities and in and around neighborhoods in Philadelphia. Rather, it was a transnational one that depended on the invisible labor of many different unnamed people in many different places. Where scholars like Kiana Whitted and Blair Davis have been most interested in the narrative and artistic content of All-Negro Comics, that is the textual and visual analyses of the stories that it contains. I was most interested in understanding just how precisely Orrin Cromwell Evans and his collaborators were able to produce and disseminate a comic book in racist post-war America. As it happens, bibliographers and material text scholars have been slow to turn their attention to both comic books as a form and African American literature as a genre. In the latter case, and I think many people in this room and online will have seen this, Jackie Goldsby and Meredith McGill argue in the June 2022 issue of the Papers of the Bibliographical Society of America that this illusion is the result of the historical coincidence of African American literature as a field taking shape at precisely the same moment that scholars were turning their attention away from the material to textual modes of analysis. In the former case, that is in comics, scholar Padmini Ray Murray has argued that scholars had not yet embraced a materialist approach to comic book history because these scholars felt the need to justify the medium on literary and artistic grounds, validating them, in other words, as a field of study. She writes, despite the growing sophistication of comic studies as a discipline, it has yet to fully embrace the cultural materialist approaches of book history and publishing studies, a fact that seems rather intriguing in the face of the form's insistent materiality. And you'll be reminded of the insistent materiality when I ask you not to leaf through All-Negro Comics, to those of you in the room, because it's incredibly fragile. These omissions extend to an eliding of the roles played by agents other than the author in the production of the text, a factor of particular significance in comics, where there is almost always a supporting cast of artists, pencilers, colorists, and letterers who contribute to the finished product. In addition, the role played by publishers and editors in the dissemination and circulation of comics and graphic novels has also been ignored in much of contemporary comics criticism. While Goldsby and McGill do not go so far as to suggest that literary scholars had not concentrated on the life cycles of African American literature for the same reason, that is, that the project of establishing the field required scholars to concentrate knowingly or unknowingly on the literary merit, they do highlight the importance of better understanding the modes of production, dissemination, and reception in words that very much echo those of Murray. Referring to that issue of the BSA papers, they write, each essay demonstrates how much bibliographic analysis can teach us about even well-known works in African American literary studies, how little we actually know about their conditions of production and circulation, and what a rich field for interpretation is turned up by careful attention to their print formats and publication history. And so my talk today, indeed my project, I think it's safe to say now it's a project, is very much in this spirit. It's about recovering what feels unrecoverable. As such, it necessarily verges into a kind of informed speculation at times, and I invite your thoughts on how I might ultimately tell a better and more complete story of how the first Black comic book was made. My talk is comprised of 6 parts. I'll begin with a consideration of the immediate historical context surrounding the comic's creation, a labor dispute at the Philadelphia Record, And then I'll introduce you to the real life protagonists who created it before taking a look inside at the stories and characters. From there, we'll consider how All-Negro Comics was printed and distributed to readers, and finally, how those readers responded to it. On the left here, you're looking at the lobby of the Philadelphia Record Building. In 1947, when our story takes place, the Record was one of at least 4 daily papers in the city. Its circulation reached 330,000 per day in 1936 under the ownership of Penn alumnus David J. Stern, who had purchased it in 1928 and then moved its operations to a more modern facility at Broad and Wood Streets, shown here on the right. I believe they are now condos, but in 1933, Stern purchased the New York Post, but contrary to the present day politics of that publication, the Record was ardently progressive at the time, announcing itself as, quote, always a friend of the working man, and supporting Al Smith and Franklin Roosevelt's presidential bids. In the early 1930s, it hired Orrin Evans, who became the first Black reporter to cover general assignments for a mainstream white newspaper in the United States. But in 1946, the Record had a labor problem. In November, some 423 employees, including Evans, represented by the CIO-affiliated American Newspaper Guild, went on strike, citing wages and working conditions. Mystified by the, quote, strange attitude of union leadership, Stern decided in February of 1947 to sell the Record and its assets to the rival newspaper, The Bulletin. In response, Evans, along with executive editor Harry T. Saylor and 3 others, established a holding company called Records Associates. Evans, who served as vice president of Records Associates, became president of its newly established subsidiary, All-Negro Comics, Inc. And records show that the eponymous publication was entered into the US Copyright Office Register 4 months later in June of 1947. All-Negro Comics was groundbreaking in that it was owned, produced, and as we'll see shortly, distributed by African Americans. It's important to note, however, that African Americans had long been involved in both the production and consumption of comics. Newspapers like the Baltimore Afro-American and Philadelphia Tribune, for which Evans worked in the 1920s, had long featured comic strips. In the 1950s, when white advertisers began to abandon Black newspapers as the civil rights movement became increasingly identified with communism, the Pittsburgh Courier even adopted a full-color comic book supplement with Black characters in hopes of generating more revenue. Describing the importance of comic books to Ralph Ellison's 1952 novel, Invisible Man, our own J.C. Cloutier, I hope, J.C., you are out there, although I know you heard a version of this talk a few months ago, writes lyrically that, quote, comics, far from being negligible garbage, harbored the transformative powers of a new, particularly American imaginary that thrived on the periphery, on the burning sidewalks of history's main thoroughfares. He goes on to show that comic books were pervasive and offered the youth of Harlem, and presumably other African-American communities, more than mere escapism. They formed an empowering counter-archive to the dominant official one that excluded them. But African Americans were not just consumers of comic books. A number of Black artists worked in the industry, including George Harriman, whose Crazy Cat was incredibly popular in the 1920s. I should note here that although Harriman was described as colored on his birth certificate, he passed as white during his lifetime. But there were many artists and writers who could or would not pass. For example, Elmer Cecil Stoner attended the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts and reportedly contributed to Detective Comics #1, best known, of course, for introducing the Batman character. He drew the Blue Beetle, which you see here, and later became a recognizable spokesperson for Gordon's Gin. Writer and historian Ken Quattro describes these as the invisible men of comics history, whose contributions to the medium's past have been all too often overlooked. One moment, please. Let's turn now to the invisible men. Yes, they were all men in this instance, behind All-Negro Comics. This is Orrin Evans at the Pyramid Club, founded in 1937 for the, quote, cultural, civic, and social advancement of Negroes in Philadelphia. You'll note that he stands between the artist, Horace Pippin, and the art collector and founder of the Barnes Foundation, Albert C. Barnes. Interestingly, the Pyramid Club's annual art exhibition generally featured painting and other fine art, but in 1942, it had showcased the work of E. Sims Campbell, who would go on to become the first Black cartoonist to be syndicated in nationally distributed slick magazines like Esquire and Playboy, and who was already famous at the time for his 1933 illustrated nightclub map of Harlem. Now, Evans had moved to Philadelphia from Steelton, Pennsylvania, a few miles outside of Harrisburg as a teenager, and graduated from West Philadelphia High School. He went on to attend Drexel University before working at the aforementioned Tribune. He contributed to various other African-American newspapers and the NAACP's The Crisis. In his late 20s or maybe early 30s, it's not clear, he moved to the Record. Although a 1971 obituary would describe him as, quote, soft-spoken and friendly, and not a professed militant, he drew both praise and scorn for writing about the hypocrisy of segregation in the armed services during the Second World War. And over the course of his career, he cultivated friendships with Black and white celebrities, including Joe Louis, Ella Fitzgerald, Paul Robeson, and Ernest Hemingway. He also made some enemies, including the Nazi sympathizer Charles Lindbergh, who reportedly once had him removed from a press conference simply because he was Black. According to Evans' daughter, Hope, who spoke with the comic artist and historian Tom Christopher, Orrin was a lifelong reader of comics who loved the syndicated strips Lil Abner and the Katzenjammer Kids. She went on to say that he was inspired by the capacity of comics to reach non-literate audiences. And so, without a job at the Record, he decided to create one of his own. Indeed, in his letter from the editor on the inside cover, there we go, on the inside cover of All-Negro Comics, Evans tells us precisely who his audience is, young and old, and what his goals are. He reminds us that every brushstroke and pen line in the drawings in these pages are by Negro artists, and each drawing is an original. That is, none has been published anywhere before. Not relinquishing the sober mantle of journalism, he continues, quote, "This publication is another milestone in the history of Negro journalism. All-Negro Comics will not only give Negro artists an opportunity to gainfully use their talents, but will glorify Negro historical achievements." He concludes by explaining how each story expresses aspects of African-American culture that deserves to be both appreciated and celebrated. Evans' commitment to pedagogy and moral uplift stands in stark contrast to the prevailing winds of the comics industry in 1947. That same year saw the first work of comics criticism, Colton Was the Comics, a fascinating real-time attempt at history as it was unfolding that described the medium as raw and ugly and characterized by soulless emptiness and outrageous vulgarity. That year also saw the formation of the Association of Comics Magazine Publishers, ACMP, in an effort to regulate content that was becoming increasingly violent and risque, and at the same time, ever more popular. Paul Hirsch's recent book, Pulp Empire, shows how following intensive government intervention in the industry during the war that was really aimed at creating an illusion of racial harmony on the home front, comic books pivoted away from costumed one-dimensional heroes and villains and focused instead on often horrific and violent crime in the nation's domestic sphere, homes, marriages, that sort of thing. So in response to this shift and to Frederick Wortham's well-documented crusade against the 10-cent plague and the epidemic of delinquency that he argued it inspired, the ACMP would eventually adopt the Comics Code as a form of self-regulation. And so in its pursuit of wholesome values, All-Negro Comics both anticipates that code with its generally anodyne stories and stands in stark contrast to the much harder stuff found in popular titles like Lev Gleason's Crime Does Not Pay. Orrin Evans may have provided the vision for and face of All-Negro Comics, but he was just one of its creators. A veteran of the Second World War, his younger brother, George, attended the Philadelphia Museum School of Industrial Art and was pursuing a career in commercial art when he joined the All-Negro Comics and drew what is arguably the most important character, Lion Man. William H. Smith, who signs his contribution as Cravat, was forced to transfer from the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts to the museum school following an episode of, quote, racial animosity at PAPFA. Graduating in 1943, he worked in the Philadelphia Navy shipyard during the war, and in its aftermath, he freelanced illustrations for the Baltimore Afro-American, the Sun, and the Philadelphia Inquirer. He would eventually open his own advertising firm. Army veteran and museum school student Leonard Cooper, whose name appears as an award winner at an Atlanta University art competition in 1946, contributed the whimsical Do Dillies to the comic book. You'll meet the Do Dillies in a moment. And yet another museum school student and Navy Yard employee, John Terrell, wrote the detective Ace Harlem, or drew the detective Ace Harlem. Terrell's artistic prowess made him an illustrator for the Navy's publication, The Beacon, and led him to draw cartoons for the Tribune, as well as the Amsterdam News and the Philadelphia Independent. All right, so let's look inside the comic book. It's comprised of 48 10¼ by 6¼ inch pages with front and rear covers and bound by 2 staples. That was pretty standard for 1947 after wartime paper shortages had reduced the page count of comic books from 64 to 48 pages. You're actually looking at Yale's copy, which bears the bookplate of its owner, Harlem Renaissance patron Carl Van Vechten. We at Penn have not yet digitized our copy, but as I alluded earlier, we have it here in the room so that we can look at it afterwards. The comic includes 6 stories and/or gags that span genres: the detective, childish whimsy, pulp fiction, superhero, domestic humor, and finally, minstrelsy. So we begin with Ace Harlem, who you don't see Ace here, but you see the opening pages. Ace's name, wardrobe, and bearing evoke Dick Tracy, the wildly popular character who had first appeared in strips in 1931. In the story, Pop, who you see here at the cash register, is the proprietor of a barbecue shack that is frequented by sharp chicks and smooth studs, and he's been strangled to death by 2 zoot suit wearing criminals. Ace checks in with the Fingerprint Bureau, where a Black forensic scientist tries to lend a hand before realizing that, in fact, his best clue is a distinctive good luck charm. He decides to consult a sort of witch doctor herbalist who confirms that he had sold it to the vicious young hep cat that you see here in the yellow trench coat. Ace then tracks the criminals back to their boarding house, reminding us of his strict moral code along the way, and finally bests them in a contest of fisticuffs. Up next, we have the Do Dillies, a kind of, I don't know, mer girl and Cupid boy drawn to neotenous effect by Leonard Cooper. They're supposedly invisible to grown-ups, and they swim, fly, quarrel, nap, and dream of food. Only finally to be presented with a sort of cannibalistic conundrum when the seagoing mer girl refuses to eat a clam and the flying Cupid boy reconsiders his appetite for eating a duck. In the end, they adopt the duck as a pet and settle on a meatless meal of fruit. Story in the pulp tradition of boys' literature, Ezekiel's Manhunt, which you see here, provides a brief and comparatively text-heavy interlude that was not uncommon in comic books of the time. In fact, interestingly, Colton Waugh, who wrote that 1947 history of the industry, claims that the pulp magazine is the real predecessor of the comic book and not, say, comic strips. This story tells of two brothers who escape a menacing poacher named Geechee, only to be rewarded by a grateful game warden at the end. We arrive next at Lion Man, notable because, as I said earlier, he's believed to be the first Black superhero in comic books. African Americans had long been portrayed in comics, typically as caricatures, such as the sidekick Ebony White, shown here in Will Eisner's The Spirit. This is a comic supplement. In fact, The Spirit first appeared in the Philadelphia Record as a comic book supplement in 1939. But in Lion Man, we have a Black superhero who predates Stan Lee and Jack Kirby's Black Panther by some 20 years. And there are also some very distinct similarities between the two. Although the writer is careful to point out that Lion Man is American born, where those of you who are comics fans will know that Black Panther comes from a fictional African country called Wakanda. Lion Man is college educated. Black Panther has a PhD from Oxford. Technologically sophisticated. Wakanda is known for its cutting edge tech. And here you see Lion Man operating his radar equipment. And committed to protecting Africa's natural resources from exploitation. Wakanda is the source of a invaluable metal called vibranium. But in the case of Lion Man, the natural resource in question is uranium, not surprising in the immediate post-war period. And in fact, it possesses enough to build a bomb that would destroy the world. Lion Man's senses are on full alert because a certain warlike nation is seeking to do just that. And in the story, Lion Man and his sidekick protect the uranium deposits from the pith helmet wearing Dr. Blut Sangro. In this panel, Lion Man socks Sangro in the face, a visual reference to an image that comic book readers during the war had seen over and over again. Although in those images, of course, the hero punching Hitler was never Black. We move next to the short bits, Hep Chicks on Parade, which attempts to find humor in the elaborate fashion choices of Black women, and Lil Eggy, which Kiana Whitted observes relocates familiar character types from Bringing Up Father, Barney Google, and Blondie to the Black middle class. The comic book concludes with Sugarfoot, which Evans tells us, quote, recaptures the lost humor of the minstrel show, but to modernize is discomfiting, and modern sensibility is difficult to reconcile with what we assume Evans' agenda to be. The same is true of how All-Negro Comics depicts women, something that Kiana Whitted points out in her upcoming essay. And in both cases, she argues that these caricatures form part of a, quote, vocabulary of Black aesthetics that allow artists to be in dialogue with prevailing visual forms. In this case, comic books dominated by racial caricatures, while subtly recasting those characters in order to reclaim their humanity. So now I want to return to All-Negro Comics as a material text. That is, the object and how it was produced, distributed, and received. I thought this group would appreciate this image. So how it was printed remains the biggest mystery, I'm sorry. No attention at all has been given to the subject. And as Padmini Ray Murray had observed earlier, very little attention has been given more generally to how comic books were printed in this period. This is remarkable when you consider just how widely consumed comic books were at the time. The aforementioned Colton Waugh, writing in 1947, tells us that 40 million comic books were printed each month in 1946. If true, that would translate into a staggering 500 million per year. Paul Hirsch cites an even higher figure, saying that 1 billion comic books were sold each month between World War II and the mid-1960s. This passage from his pulp empire explains just how ubiquitous a feature comic books were in the material and textual landscape of American life. He writes, They were available to anyone of any age at newsstands, drugstores, and markets. Comics were everywhere, in schools and waiting rooms, in the back seats of cars, beneath children's beds, and wedged between the pages of textbooks. They could even be found in the trenches of the Nevada desert, where troops huddled during post-war atomic tests. Indeed, Hirsch's book goes on to talk about how American GIs sort of spread comic books throughout the world during the war. So it's striking then that we know so much of the early artists and writers, even the genesis of publishing houses like EC, DC, and Marvel, but relatively little about how comic books were printed and who did it. Waugh's 1947 real-time reportage of the industry is the best account I've been able to find. He states that Eastern Color Printing, later EC Comics, was the first to produce a modern comic book. He goes on to tell us that comic book printing was highly centralized, with a small number of concerns that also included World Color Press from St. Louis and Greater Buffalo Press, accounting for more than 5/8 of all new comic books. Where Eastern Color was also a publisher, the others were really large scale, I guess we would call them job printers. With the technology, the in-house expertise required to print in color, to trim, to collate, and to bind comic books before finally they were shipped for sale. While it's tempting to assume that in the time between November 1946, when the staff of the Philadelphia Record went on strike, and February of 1947, Evans and his collaborators, including the Record's editor, Harry Saylor, simply made use of the dormant printing facilities at Broad and Wood Streets to print All-Negro Comics, Waugh's account, and the testimony of several industry insiders that I've spoken to, including the former DC Comics president, Paul Levitz, it's extremely unlikely that this would have been possible. Most newspapers did not print in color at the time, and in fact relied on these specialized printers to provide comic supplements, like The Spirit, that were becoming increasingly popular. So my efforts to better understand how comic books were printed led me to Magazine Land USA, a comic book mashup of Marvel and DC heroes that World Color Press produced in 1977 to mark its 75th anniversary and to showcase how it produced comic books at an industrial scale. And so this image you're looking at now comes from Magazine Land USA. You can see that after the original art here, this is the owner of World Color Press taking us on his tour of the plant. And anecdotally, Paul Levitz told me that he actually was on the tour of the plant. You can find a very grainy like YouTube video of this like little sort of like tram tour going through the factory from 1977. So you can see here that after the original artwork is photographed, that the images are transferred to metal plates where fine hand tooling is done to the engravings. And in his book, Waugh notes that the color is the work of certain specialists at the printing plant, confirming that this work did not happen in the same offices, generally in New York City, where publishers were based and writers and artists created original content subject to the equally demanding work rhythms of industrial labor. From there, the papier-mâché impressions or flong are used to create curved stereotype plates. Oh, let's see, there we go. There's the guy holding his flong. And then paper is run through the 4-color press and then binding machines, and the resulting comic book is trimmed, cleaned, set, and readied for distribution. There we go. And so we have these wonderful sort of sequences of superheroes at various parts of the production process. The Hulk being told to trim his nails. A closer look at the publication. So moving back to All-Negro Comics here, a closer look at the publication information. This is really hard to read, I'm sorry. But it reveals the publisher's address at 1301 Spruce Street in Philadelphia, which served as the mailing address for All-Negro Comics, Inc., but could not have been where the comic book was printed. Instead, it tells us simply that it was printed in the USA. This kind of generic assessment was not statement was not uncommon at the time, and it makes uncovering the invisible labor of comic book production all the more difficult to unearth. I sort of sampled other comics from 1947, and they almost all say printed in the USA. One industry insider suggested that the secondary post office entry listed here for Buffalo, New York, may have meant that it was printed at Greater Buffalo Press. I have written to the corporate conglomerates that bought the press in the 1990s in hope of locating the business records, but I have received no response. That's actually not true. Just this afternoon, I received a response from them saying that they knew nothing about Greater Buffalo Press, and then wrote back saying, I'm sorry, we actually did buy a company that had bought it previously in the 90s. So they seem interested, and maybe, who knows, maybe they'll turn something up. I've also written to the multinational company that purchased World Color Press and have had no luck there. There's a small Eastern color printing archive at the Connecticut Historical Society, but it stopped short of 1947. And so, to put it simply, I've been unable to locate relevant records, something that might constitute the smoking gun. I'm imagining a ledger entry with Orrin Evans or All-Negro Comics Inc. name on it. Bear with me here. So, still more intriguing and perhaps bibliographically significant, I conducted a side-by-side comparison of the Yale copy and the Penn copy of All-Negro Comic, and revealed that the flip side of this advertisement, you can see barely in the sort of gutter of the Yale one, that it's the chicks that is opposite the advertisement, whereas in the Penn copy, the Sugarfoot story is opposite the advertisement. So in both copies, the recto of the leaf with that ad shows the final page of the Lion Man story. This suggests that maybe this is just a difference in the binding process and not in a printing process. But elsewhere, we see differences in coloring, in kind of like tone and also kind of precision, it seems to me, that may or may not simply be the product of time or degradation. I really don't know. But it does make me wonder if there are multiple print runs of All-Negro Comics, and if the comic book might also have been printed in multiple locations. I heard a story from Stan Lee of Marvel recently, who identified a collector's comic because having been printed at a plant in Ohio because they messed the color up or something. And so, these kinds of things do happen. Anyway, I welcome thoughts from the audience on this comparison of the two copies. As I said, sort of informed speculation is where I am. Okay, so we're going to move on to distribution. World Color Press had operated out of St. Louis before opening a satellite plant, the one you see depicted in the images that I've shown earlier, in 1948. Its central location was ideal for the transnational distribution of comic books, as this diagram shows, and it becomes all the more intriguing when we consider a critical piece of evidence that Kiana Whitted shared with me from Emory's Rose Library, correspondence between Orrin Evans and the distributor Carol Ellis of the National News Company in Chicago. In October, some 3 months after All-Negro Comics had been issued, Ellis wrote to Evans that nearly half of the 3,000 copies that the National News Company had been distributing remained unsold. Ellis speculated as to why this might be the case, suggesting that the public was simply not familiar with it and that Evans might consider some sort of fly sheet that would call attention to it on newsstands. This, he says, worked for the new Slick magazine, Negro Digest, which he also distributed and which would enjoy a successful run for another 34 years. From a logistical point of view, it might have made sense for All-Negro Comics to be printed in St. Louis so that it could be distributed in and around Chicago. But again, we just don't know. This slide shows Carol Ellis a few years earlier at the first meeting of the National Negro News Distributors Association, a trade group for African-American news distributors that followed the formation of similar group representing publishers. Both ultimately met with failure after a couple of years. You'll see that he's seated alongside colleagues from Newark, New Haven, St. Louis, Philadelphia, Mount Vernon, and New York City. Citing a renaissance of Negro magazines, the group produced a sort of digest that is circulated nationally in hopes of promoting itself as an authoritative source for African American news. This copy of the digest belonged to D.G. Gibson, a California-based distributor, and resides in the collection of the African American Museum and Library in Oakland, which suggests that the nascent distribution network stretched as far as the West Coast. To summarize then, we have evidence that All-Negro Comics circulated in Chicago via Carol Ellis and the National News Company. We know that Ellis was just one of many distributors who had recently resolved to work together as part of the association. And thanks to another letter surfaced by Keanu Whitted, we also know that Evans sought to boost sales himself, writing a letter to a Tennessee principal urging him to drum up student subscriptions so that he could continue to produce the comic book. Furthermore, accounts in the Black press at the time revealed that Evans intended to print 300,000 copies and to distribute the comic book as far afield as the West Indies, though it is impossible to know if that number was ever met. All of these factors combine to confirm that All-Negro Comics at least circulated well beyond Philadelphia and perhaps even outside of the country. So what did readers who bought or otherwise acquired All-Negro Comics, as Paul Hirsch convincingly argues, it's widely understood that comic books were aggressively recirculated more than other textual forms, think about it? Most of what we know about how the comic book was received by audiences comes from reviews in the Black press. The Atlanta Daily World reported an enthusiastic reception among teachers, news dealers, and distributors. The Chicago Defender compared it unfavorably to Negro Heroes, pointing out that it was a commercial venture with a comparatively weak social message. So Negro Heroes, we have a copy here in the room, was published by the white-owned Parents Magazine Press and featured historical biographies in comic book form of individuals like Jackie Robinson, George Washington Carver, and Penn's own Sadie Tanner Mosel Alexander. I believe the comic book comes from the Alexander papers here in the University Archives. This image shows Sadie Tanner Mosel Alexander examining the comic book with a group of young people. George S. Schuyler, the prominent African-American critic whose politics had begun to careen to the right by 1947, rather begrudgingly noted that while comics no longer lift him, All-Negro Comics was better than most he had seen. And in her nationally syndicated My Day column, which ran from 1935 to 1962, Eleanor Roosevelt offered a sentiment very similar to that, saying that while she was not very fond of comic books herself, she recognized that her children and grandchildren thought that she knew that they were widely consumed, and that this one in particular showed, quote, the best side of the Negro, which she added, we can well afford because so many people are doing the opposite. What we lack, unfortunately, in spite of these sort of celebrity testimonials, are accounts by everyday readers, boys and girls like those shown in the photograph, reflecting on what All-Negro Comics meant to them. So Evans made clear that his intention was to, that All-Negro Comics was here to stay, that Ace Harlem, Lion Man, and Sugarfoot would return in a month's time, but they didn't. There was no second issue of All-Negro Comics, though reportedly the artwork was completed. What in the end foiled Evans' ambitions? Might cost have played a factor? At 15 cents per copy, it was 50% more expensive than other comic books in 1947. Comic books wouldn't command that price until 1969. Several accounts report that a newsprint wholesaler refused to supply the second issue. But these are sort of secondary sort of accounts. There's no sort of detail to them. But if Evans was able to tap into an established network of African-American newspaper distributors to get copies of All-Negro Comics to readers, could he not have also drawn on that network to support, to source newsprint? After all, African-American newspapers had emerged from the Second World War stronger than ever, with higher circulation numbers than they had seen before. So somebody was supplying them with paper. Might the answer lie in a lack of sympathy on the part of highly specialized and undoubtedly white-owned printing facilities at World Color, Eastern Color, Greater Buffalo Press? We don't know. Blair Davis cites the systemic oppression of the comics industry, an industry that would not give serious attention to African Americans for another 2 decades. And while the statement is no doubt true, getting to the bottom of why Evans' ambitions were ultimately foiled requires a better understanding of the precise circumstances of the comic book's production, distribution, and consumption than we currently have. Here we need to better understand the history of the comics industry itself and exactly how systemic racism operated up and down a transnational supply chain from the point of creation to the newsstand. What we do know is that in the aftermath of the strike at the Record and the evanescent experiment that was All-Negro Comics, the 42-year-old Orrin Evans would return to the newspaper business, first at the Chester Times and then at the Philadelphia Bulletin. By the time he died in 1971, he had earned numerous awards and was widely known as, quote, the Dean of Black Newspapermen. His obituary in the city's largest paper, The Inquirer, celebrated these achievements, but made no mention at all of All-Negro Comics. Thank you.
Okay, well, the floor is open for questions, and maybe we can switch, Sean, to switch to gallery. Stop sharing to gallery.
Yep.
There we go. We can see everyone. And let's move on. Mike should pick up questions from the room for people on Zoom.
Okay. Hey, Sean, thanks so much. This is great. Really made a lot of progress on this since last time I heard the story. But I have a question about who is writing it? Were the artists also the ones writing the stories? Do you have a sense of that?
I don't have an answer for that. I mean, like, generally, it's not one and the same, but
Right,
I
that's
don't.
why
There's no attribution in the comic. I don't know.
So all the artists are credited and none of the writers.
Well, the artist gets assigned.
I forgot to tell people on Zoom to use that raise hand function if you have a question.
Just an observation, the coming attractions that you showed at last, where it says advising kids to stick to the church and use your energy up in good, clean sports, and says that the next issue you're going to read about Negro trailblazers and champions in the sports world. It sounds much more serious and uplifting than the issue that it appears at the end of it. In fact, it sounds like Negro heroes.
Yeah.
So how, and Negro heroes was already appearing in 47 or?
It appeared. I think it appeared soon after.
Yeah.
I think there's a few months separating them. I don't know the exact. The exact, but I think All-Negro Comics was released first. But yeah, there is a kind of overlap. There's definitely a kind of thematic overlap. Although at the same time, Evans tells us that all of these same heroes are going to return as well. So it's suggesting a kind of serialized existence. Yeah, so to be sure.
Thank you. That was really great. Very interesting. Found incredible stuff. So why does it cost 15 cents? I mean, why would you price it so much higher? That just seems like the first obvious problem, you know?
Yeah.
If the other comics are 10 cents.
I mean, I assume it has to do with whatever cost recovery analysis Evans and his collaborators were doing. The letter to the Tennessee principal suggests, let's see, that he would sell it, I think, for like 9 cents a copy, and there would be some 6 cents for a profit for the school district or something.
Is it printed 15 cents on the issue?
It is, yeah.
Did other comic books carry advertising, and did this carry advertising?
This does not carry advertising, and I asked that question. This is where like it's really helpful to talk to people who just worked in the industry. But apparently early on, and in fact, Colton Waugh addresses this in his 1947 book, that advertisers just wanted no part of comics at this time. They just thought it was not going to stay, that it was, you know, the reputational risk was such that it just didn't make any sense. So, and then similarly, the Black newspapers, I mean, a bit of reading that I've done on History of the Black Press suggests, as I said, that they were actually dependent on white companies advertising, and then with the associations of communism and civil rights movement, then they started losing that revenue stream. But advertising, I thought of that early on, like maybe this just didn't work because they weren't in the advertising.
So, I mean, but Dick Tracy, you would send to coder rooms, and Charles Atlas, who was running ads and comic books. Was he running ads and comic books at this period, you know, at the back of the issue, you would right away to.
Yeah, I mean,
get the key to not paying 75-pound weekly or whatever.
yeah, at the same time that I did a sort of, I mean, pretty superficial sampling of looking to see if most comic books just said printed in the USA, I did kind of leaf through them, and there really wasn't not that much advertising at that point. So that certainly changed by the time I was.
Yeah, Larry.
I've been sort of studying the chronology of the emergence of the Disney cartoons and and the appearance of Song of the South and the dwarfication of Uncle Remus, and it's almost on exactly the same timeline. And so in Uncle Remus, you have a completely different approach to representing blacks. And so I don't know, I'm just suggesting that it's something you might want to look into as a comparison, because there was so much controversy about movies on the South, but they were exactly the same time. The Disney people, of course, introduced a comic strip at about the same time, which stuck in the newspaper.
There is a literature out there that I have not read, but I would hopefully like to get to about sort of reappropriation of like minstrelsy by African Americans, which I think is more or less what John is saying is happening there with Snake and Sugarfoot. Even if, you know, to our sensibilities, I mean, even when we acquired it, we were advertising this event, you know, we had sort of internal discussions about what sort of appropriate for our industry. For fear that a lack of context could be problematic.
I think you really hit a very interesting topic that fits into chronology and Black history. I think it'll serve as a great contrast to other things that have been.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. It's a really interesting, great talk. I learned a lot. I'm interested, one, in the recapturing of minstrelsy and how color printing intersects with that, because, you know, the minstrelsy traditions, you know, there are visual markers that are racializing, right? And so, but it seems like in some of the other ones, like Lion Man or some of the earlier parts, they're not using racializing visual cues, right, in the same way. So like color printing becomes important in an interesting way. That's just more of a side comment though. I was mostly interested in asking if you have any more comment on failure. So like, you know, it's like we have this one issue, like why did it fail? We talked about the distribution kind of collective Black distributors of media, like that failed. Like there were a couple moments where you mentioned kind of failure. I mean, I can make uneducated or, you know, informed as a person who has lived in America guesses about why these things failed, but I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on that. Like why are all these things, these collective attempts to distribute Black media failing in that particular moment?
Oh, yeah, interesting. So like the Distributors Association and the
Yeah.
Publishers Association also failing. Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know. I mean, I mean, part of this sort of exploration comes from the kind of the anecdotal nature of the explanation of failure, it being systemic racism, which I don't doubt, but I feel like kind of really zooming in on the process so that we can sort of more precisely see how it operated in that industry is the important thing. I don't know. I know that you know, as I said a couple times, that, you know, Black newspapers faced their own challenges at this time period. Whether that contributed, I don't know. You know, I'd be loath to speculate. It's an interesting question. You know, and I think, and it even, I mean, even relates specifically to the comic book and how we sort of think about it as like, you know, as some sort of like curious anomaly, or as actually sort of mattering.
Thank you, Sean. This is totally fascinating. I know absolutely nothing about comics, but I was wondering if there was a way, I mean, if there's a way of sort of determining this kind of relative kind of survival of the rarity of this, you know, single issue. I mean, based on the print run and how many copies are known, you mentioned OCLC now, and whether, you know, comic book specialists sort of keep track of their sort of index of rarity, and also what that might tell us as to, you know, I mean, you know, I come from the perspective of medieval manuscript where we assume that, you know, most of what was produced was lost, and in fact, the things that were most popular were, you know, frequently used so often and read so often that they were, you know, discarded eventually. And is there a similar phenomenon in comic books? And then the sort of slightly related question: are there other comparable instances of comics with us where only a single issue appeared in the same year that might be there by way of comparison?
I don't know the answer to that. And nor do I know the answer as to whether or not there's some index of rarity or Zach has found one.
Well, there's a website that JC told me about when I was selling my childhood comics. My parents' basement, called mycomicshop.com. And they do have they don't have it in stock, but they do a census for comic books based on users saying what they have. And they know of 40 copies.
Really?
And so, I mean, it's certainly the kind of thing that would be in private hands.
Yeah.
That OCLC would not.
Right.
It would not be a great guide to. So I wonder if there's more like fan routes you could take for finding more copies and maybe people willing to, you know, tell you which page that ad appears on.
Yeah, that would be really interesting to do a broader census. I think, Nick, part of the reason I shared all of these quotes about just the sheer volume of comic books is that sort of the scarcity relative to the overall volume being produced at the time. And I joked with John a few times, which was the talk last year, the material text talk by
Andrew Pettigrew and
Yeah.
on loss and like the lost books of early modern Europe. It's
right, where there's this kind of implicit argument that most of what survives is what people didn't actually read. And so we know, you know, we know that people read and loved comic books. And so but that's interesting. I'd love to do. I was almost hesitant to share this side-by-side comparison because I'm not sure what it actually sort of tells us. But then, you know, your comment with me about coloring, there are probably comics fans out here. JC is on the comic book story better than I do. But when I think Marvel introduced one of its first Black characters, the printer thought it was a mistake, and they sent it back. And you know, I don't know if it would stand claim credit for everything, but you know, had to tell them, no, we actually want this Black character. We want this person colored in this.
I think Jacqueline Gold
Oh, great. I hope I-
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great, terrific. Sean, thank you so much for this amazing talk. I really enjoyed learning with it. I'm reluctant to go on screen, even though I could, because it's weird to be in a room, I think, when you're beaming in from Zoom and into a live setting. But in any event, I had three quick comments, maybe observations to pick up on some of the really rich kind of aporias that you're left with as you begin this really exciting and important research. First of all, about trying to track down who printed the comic. I'm wondering, I have a question and then a comment. One, the Philadelphia Tribune, what firm published their newspaper? Do you know?
You're interesting. You're posing a question that I've only embarrassingly recently begun to consider, which is that it's the record. If the record
Oh, the record. Okay, yeah. Okay.
also was the first to include the Spirit supplement,
Uh-huh.
is it not possible that they would have sort of relied on the same printer?
Right. Right.
By social networks or something.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that printer, I did, in fact, just a few moments before this talk, was kind of poking around a little bit, and there is a connection between the syndicate that produced the Spirit
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
Greater Baltimore Press Inc., which again calls more attention.
Yeah. No, that makes sense to me because Robert Abbott, who published the Chicago Defender very famously in the wake of the 1919 race riot in Chicago, when his efforts to keep up with covering that event on a daily basis was frustrated by the white printers in Chicago that ordinarily, printed the Defender, blocked him. And so he bought his own press. And so that's to say there might be a way of looking at, the network of Black printers that were supporting Black newspapers, starting with the record and then thinking out from there. And also in terms of the color inking capacities, I wonder, I don't know it off the top of my head, but it might be worth looking at Abbott's Monthly, the standalone periodical that Robert Abbott published as part of the Chicago Defender, but it was a beautifully illustrated, color inked periodical that carried cartoons and short fiction and all kinds of other material. Chester Himes famously published his early short stories there. So you might look at those copies of Abbott's Monthly to see who printed that periodical, and maybe there might be a connection there. And that goes to another point about the inking of the two copies that you showed us from Yale and Penn, which was fascinating. I have to say, as I recall them, I don't know. I mean, on the one hand, the Penn copy that was better inked. Am I remembering that correctly?
I think
The Penn copy had richer color.
Yeah.
which is kind of frustrating, but
Yeah. Okay. At the same time, it seemed, how shall I say? There's a lot of coloring out of the lines, it seemed to me too. But in any event, you pose the really intriguing question of, whether or not the inking on the one hand, but more importantly, the pagination might have suggested regional differences. That might be really worth poking into, because that was the strategy of the Baltimore Afro-American. That there is the Baltimore Afro-American, and there the paper published, I can't recall how many, but a number of regional editions that to span the Southeast. So this was a tactic, a strategy of the Black press, so that the kind of made the metropolitan locale, the Chicago Defender, also had regional editions. And that was the case for the Baltimore Afro-American. So this is a practice that's not uncommon. And then my third point, so that might be worth looking into. My third point about why the second issue didn't take off, the failure question that you were addressing before. You made the point, I think it's something we're thinking with, that in 1947, 1947 to about 1965 or so, the Black press really is in its heyday. The mid-century Black press, in my view, is in its heyday. And it's featuring a really robust coverage of visual material and genre fiction. This is the argument of Brooks Hefner's really terrific book, Black Pulp, that just came out last year. And so it could very well be that the standalone comic book doesn't have the quite same life that it could, because that material, that energy, that kind of visual and narrative energy is being addressed by the Black press. Because one of the points and one of the really amazing kind of magazine, or rather periodical histories that Brooks Hefner is tracing in Black Pulp is the centrality of serialized, syndicated pulp fiction in the Black press after World War II. And so it may very well be that the audience for the All-Negro Comics maybe had too many cheap alternatives to go to, and people had to figure out where they're going to spend their 15 cents. They might get more bang for their buck, so to say, by buying the Defender or the Baltimore Afro-American, which really was a hotbed of this kind of syndicated fiction, instead of also paying 15 cents for a standalone comic as well. So there might be something to say or to think with, alongside Brooks Hefner's account of the rise of Black pulp fiction with, incredibly charged cartooning that goes with this, not color, but really energetic cartooning that goes along with this genre fiction in the Black press during the 1940s after World War II.
Wow, those are all great observations. Thank you. On the last point, which is especially intriguing, and I'm forgetting the numbers, but the Colton Waugh book, he does make reference to how many of those, what was it, 50 million per month that were being published were actually like one and done. So it actually wasn't that unusual in general for the genre. So.
Well, good luck with your work. It's really terrific.
I really appreciate your thoughts.
Gosh, in the back.
Thanks for this very interesting meeting. I have a question about the structure of the book, which is maybe something of an intended audience question. The 5 different sections, is that typical of other comics that are produced during this time? Are they intended for different audiences in the covers of a single comic book? And what kind of implications of comic books might that have, depending on what the regarding?
Yeah, that's a great question. Again, I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I think several of the comic book supplements that newspapers ran did have these sort of shorter bits in them. But relative to the sort of comic book as a form at the time, how many of them were sort of like a sustained story? I don't know. I'm sure there are probably maybe people on this call who can answer that as well.
I was struck by this too. I mean, it's either something that's expected or it's like, well, we're going to try 6 different things and we really don't know what our readers want, in which case it would be a kind of experimental.
Well, in Ace Harlan with a couple of sort of gruesome murders is very different from the due diligence, right?
It's like totally different genre.
I hate to say it, but I was reading comic books about that time. Or soon thereafter. And they were chopped up. They were chopped up. They had large stories in them. And it was so discouraging if you get so involved in one story, and then all of a sudden it would end and it'd be something completely different. But my impression was that they were chopped up. Okay.
another question that I really love the way, Sean, you sort of try to set out all these, set this story into some of these larger book historical questions that you like to think about. I mean, I guess one that I didn't hear you say so much about is the capital, the sort of, at least in the the earlier book history moment of like who's paying, who's the publisher. And I don't know, so what kind of investment does this really represent in a world where maybe there are lots of failures and maybe there's some access to other allies in the industry, but maybe not? Do you have any sense of where?
I don't. I mean, I've wondered if somewhere in the city archives there's some record of this Records Associates being established and then the subsidiary as well. I mean, Harry Saylor was the editor of the records, so and I can't remember if the other collaborators are named. So in that sense, then Harry Saylor was an ally. Whether or not they provided all of the resourcing or much of it, I don't know. That's an important question.
Yeah, no, I was thinking about this, I was talking to Jerry about it, because it seems like the business side of this is really important to follow. I mean, is it the case that they paid the printers, and therefore the printers wouldn't print the second issue, or, they saw that so few sold that nobody wanted to continue the investment? I mean, I think there are all these questions, because it is a business, in a sense, there is that business side of it. And somebody's got to pay, and if you're not selling enough of them at 15 cents to be able to recoup the cost of printing, even though you've got the second issue ready to go, you just may not be able to actually do it.
Well, the people who don't know that they own Greater Buffalo Press do have that ledger that I'm looking at. I mean, it would be great to know if they never did receive the payment.
Yeah.
Were you able to track down what was at 1310 Spruce Street in 1947? Was it an office building? Was it a residence?
I had looked for photographs on the same source where I had the record building. And I don't know what the use was. I think it was offices. So, I mean, that's the sense. I mean, it's it's right there in Center City, so it just wouldn't have had the. I mean, obviously brought in with a pretty close too, but that facility was printing the newspapers that had previously been the Packard Motor Car Company, I guess. So it was just a huge building. 1310 office is not really that large, so I assume it was a failing over. I have not done this, but I would like to get a historical marker for that spot, perhaps. I thought that would be a worthy endeavor. It seems like it's